Ethics Untangled is made by the Idea Centre at the University of Leeds. It's a podcast about the difficult ethical questions we face in everyday life. In each episode, I interview someone, usually a philosopher, who's spent time thinking through one of these questions, and we try between us to work out what's going on. For this episode, I spoke to Professor Fiona Woollard from the University of Southampton. Professor Woollard has research interests including the philosophy of sex and the philosophy of pregnancy, birth and early motherhood. Her recent research has led her to ask a question which turns out to be surprisingly difficult to answer. What is a mother? Okay, so I'm here with Fiona Woollard. Welcome to the podcast, Fiona. And we're going to discuss the topic today, what is a mother? And I was wondering, to kick this off, if I could maybe start by reading out a little bit from your paper. And there's a case study that you have in that paper, which I think illustrates the kind of starting point for this research. So it says this: a video shows a job interview for the position of Director of Operations. Candidates are told that the job requires them to be constantly on their feet. There are no breaks available, no vacations, and no time to sleep. You can have lunch, but only when the associate has finished their lunch. The associate needs constant attention. If you had a life, we'd really ask you to give that life up. They must do all this with a happy disposition. When the candidates express disbelief at the demands of this job, they're informed that this job is already held by moms. Their eyes well up with tears, and each vows to send their mother a lovely Mother's Day card. And this is a wildly successful advert from American Greetings, a company that makes greetings cards. Okay, so if our listeners want to see that advert for themselves, I believe they can look that up on YouTube. And for you, that advert kind of sums up a view of motherhood there that you think is basically a bit problematic. So could you tell me a bit more about what you think that shows?
Absolutely. So first, I just want to say that I do love Mother's Day, and I do like getting chocolates and Mother's Day cards. So don't. If my kids are watching, don't take this as a permission not to give me a Mother's Day card. But I think the advert is really problematic because it involves a really over-demanding and unrealistic image of motherhood. I mean, no actual mother lives up to that. And I think that picture of motherhood, it's not just restricted to this particular advert or to Mother's Day cards in general. It's a very influential, powerful picture of how mothers are or how they should be. Mm-hmm. So this is known as normative motherhood, or as the ideology of motherhood. And it's basically an image of how good mothers are or how mothers should be, that it claims to be descriptive. So it says this is what mothers are, but it's not really descriptive. It's actually what we call normative. So it's giving an ideal, a measuring stick for mothers to live up to, or in fact, to inevitably fail to live up to. And I think that kind of picture of motherhood as something involving immense self-sacrifice that you do entirely on your own, where this self-sacrifice brings women huge joy, I think that's a very damaging image of motherhood.
Yeah, and so completely understandably, people have taken issue with this idea of motherhood, which, as you say, is being used as a kind of unattainable yardstick, and something that mothers can be measured against this yardstick and found to not live up to it, and some people have tried to critique that.
Absolutely, yeah. There's a long-standing, so decades-long tradition of critiquing and resisting this ideal of motherhood. So we're talking about, so one of the classics is Sharon Hayes' Cultural Contradictions of Motherhood. We've got work by Kulkler. We've got work by Sarah Ruddick. Loads of a really rich literature which is questioning this ideal of motherhood and in some cases trying to put forward alternatives different ways of thinking about mothering.
Right, okay. So, and within that literature, the alternative is not to stop thinking of yourself as a mother. It's that there should be another way of conceptualizing motherhood which doesn't run into these problematic aspects.
Absolutely, yeah. The idea is not that, some people do think that we should stop thinking about mothers and just start thinking about parents, right. So gender-neutralizing parenting. Mm-hmm. But actually the literature that I'm mostly engaged with is saying mothering is something really valuable and important, but we need to find empowering ways to do it.
Okay, good. Right. So the question that we're here to talk about today, though, is what counts as a mother, right? So, and this is kind of a challenge to those attempts that have been made to critique motherhood. So it might be that some of those writers have sort of maybe taken it as read that we know what a mother is, but you're saying that actually it might not be as clear as that.
So actually, I think almost from the beginning there has been questions about what counts as a mother, but certainly there's a concern when we talk about normative motherhood. We talk about how the effects this has on mothers. So we're using this term mother all the time, and the worry is that if we're using the term mother, are we implicitly accepting an idea of stay-at-home mom, married to a nice husband who's a father who brings home the bacon? Are we implicitly accepting ideas about what a family is that maybe not every family fits into? So I think there's a real move, just generally, to think about ways in which we might be making assumptions about who we're talking to, and a concern for inclusivity. So thinking about LGBT families and making sure that we're not leaving them out. And a standard response with that is to say, let's go gender neutral. Let's not talk about mothers, let's talk about parents, for example. You see that, for example, in guidance about in the hospital settings. So you don't assume that the partner of the person giving birth is going to be the father, because they might not be. So there is this move towards gender neutral terms in order to make our language more inclusive so that we don't exclude people unnecessarily. But there's a problem, because in the case of normative motherhood and resistance to normative motherhood, the very thing that we're trying to criticize and fight against isn't gender neutral.
Yes.
So if we gender neutralize it, it's true that mothers face unrealistic demands, but it's not true that parents face unrealistic demands. So we can't take that gender neutral approach, which in many cases is really effective, and I fully support it in cases where it works, but in this particular case, I don't think that strategy is available. So what we need to do is to think, how are we thinking about who counts as a mother, and try and think about this sort of what I call a gendered phenomenon in a way that doesn't exclude LGBT families.
Right, okay. And I should say that the title of this episode is What is a Mother? And we're going to take it as read, are we, that there are certain people who count as parents, right? So it might be, I suppose, that there are problems associated with working out who counts as a parent and who doesn't. But that's not the question we're trying to answer. So we're going to take it as read that there are some people who count as parents. And the question we're looking at is, when should a parent count as a mother?
That's right, yeah. There's a huge literature on when does somebody count as a parent, which is really interesting and exciting, but it's just too much to try and deal with that, I think, as well as when does a parent count as a mother.
So there is a really simple answer to that question, which I suppose might be a naive answer, but it's probably the answer that most people might come to if asked that question. And that's, well, a parent counts as a mother when that parent is a woman, right? So a mother is a parent who's a woman. And so what's wrong with that?
So I have two problems with that view. So one is, I think there are quite a lot of people who either are women and parents but don't understand themselves as mothers, or are not women but see themselves as mothers. Mm-hmm. So I actually started thinking about this after having some conversations with women who were parents who didn't see themselves as mothers, and were kind of surprised at why I was so determined to come up with a good ideal of motherhood. Yeah. And good kind of one thing I'm working on is a good account of what mothers are required to do for their children. Mm. And their question is, why? Why not just focus on what a parent's required to do? And during this conversation, it came out that they just didn't see themselves as mothers. Mm-hmm. And there's also lots of empirical research on LGBT families and ways in which they kind of negotiate gender and gendered parenting. Yeah. And there are lesbian dads, there are gay dads who see one of the parents as a mother. Yeah. There are there's just a really wide variety when it comes to trans parents. Mm-hmm. About how they negotiate gendered parental roles. So I think it's very important. Well, I think it's really important to respect how people understand their parenting roles. Yes. But I also think it should at least give us pause. So even if we don't think that there's a kind of you need to respect how people think about themselves, yes, it doesn't seem as if these people have a problem with English. You know, it's not like they don't know what words mean. Yes. And if we think it's just a really clear fact that so mother equals woman plus parent, they would be making the kind of mistake that you'd be making if you said, I'm a bachelor but I'm married. Right. Which would suggest you didn't understand what bachelor means. So I think we should hesitate before assuming that smart people are making basic mistakes with language. Sure. So that was reason one. Okay. I know I've talked for a lot, but the other thing is that I actually think that when you do that thinking, when recognizing these cases causes you to reflect, it becomes clear that actually it's not the gender and the parent bit of being a mother are not two separate things. It's not like you're a parent who happens to be a woman when you're a mother. The fact that the gendered bit affects the parenting role. So the role itself of being a mother is a gendered role and in some way associated with being it's in some way a female parenting role.
Okay, great. So in the examples you give, there are going to be cases where the gender, someone's gender, and the fact of their being a mother or their membership of the category of mother are going to come apart. Because, of course, woman is itself a contested category in some ways, but that's not what we're talking about here. So it's not just that we need to work out what counts as a woman and then we can read off from the fact that that person is a woman and they're also a parent that they're a mother. Because some of your examples would seem to kind of problematize that. So you could, for example, have a gay couple, a male couple who have children. They both identify as men, but perhaps one of them might identify as the child's mother.
That's right. Yep. And so I think that their role, the parenting role, is itself gendered, And the way in which the parenting role is gendered can come apart from the gender of the person.
Yes.
So we can have somebody who has a male gender identity, they are male, they are a man, and a female gendered parental role. So they have so they're a mother even though they're a man. And I mean, I described this at one point as it being the way in which mothering is the way in which women parent, but I don't think that's quite right, because as I'm arguing, I think you can be a man and you can mother. But there's something about the role that is gendered.
Yeah, of course. So like when you sort of make statements like, you know, mothering is the way that women parent, then I suppose the worry is that we might end up back in the problems that we had right at the start, where we've got a kind of normative way of thinking about these things. So we're saying that, if we're saying that women parent in a certain way, then we're back in the realm of stereotypes, and all those problematic things come back.
Yes, that's right. Yeah, so I think there are questions about how we can talk about motherhood without accepting the kind of this idea that there is one way that all to be a mother and a parent.
Okay, good. So that's the question, that's the problem. And then in order to answer that question, you've gone back to the literature, to the philosophical literature on identity, right? And there are some different accounts of identity in that literature, and what it is to have a particular identity or gender identity. So could you take us through a few of those?
I've been looking at work in the metaphysics of gender. I've been really deeply influenced by many people, actually, but perhaps primarily by somebody called Catherine Jenkins. So she has a book coming out from OUP, available in all good bookshops in 2023. Great book. So Jenkins is particularly interested in emancipatory projects. So that's cases where we're interested in understanding how the world is in order to really make it a better place, a more just place, in order to reduce oppression.
Yeah.
So Jenkins says, look, there are different groups that we would want to pick out for different particular things that we're trying to understand in order to make the world a better place. Mm-hmm. So we have lots of different, what she calls gender kinds. And she separates that question, the question of what important groups are there, from the question of how should we use particular gender terms. Mm-hmm. So I was a little bit disappointed because I was kind of hoping I could go to the metaphysics of gender, get an account of how we use woman, and then say, okay, mothering is going to be gendered. We're going to use the term mother to reflect a gendered parental role, plugging in the correct account of who counts as a woman. Turns out I can't do that, because what the metaphysics of gender does on Jenkins' account, and many people have similar kind of points, is just pick out groups that are relevant, and then we have to think about ethical considerations, moral considerations, when we're deciding how should we use terms. Right. Because it might be that there is a term that picks out a particular group, but we don't want to use, that we have ethical reasons for not using that term to pick out that group. So gender identity kinds, these are kinds which relate to the person's, what Jenkins calls their experienced relationship to a category. Mm-hmm. So their understanding of themselves in terms of this category. Right. And Jenkins identifies two, and then I want to add another one. So we have gender identity as norm relevancy, which is Jenkins. This was what she originally put forward as the account of gender identity before she went pluralist. Okay. And she says that You have gender identity as norm relevancy when you see yourself as subject to certain norms, or to the norms that are related to that category. I might, for example, and you can see yourself as subject to norms even if you disagree with them. There is a norm in our society that women should be completely hairless, apart from their heads. And so I see that norm as relevant to me because I see myself as a woman. Yeah. Even if I don't actually think that women should be completely hairless. Yeah. So if I don't shave my legs, I can't do that in the same way that I'm making assumptions, but assuming that you have you don't have this gender identity as norm relevancy of being female, then you could just not shave your legs. I can't do that. I can only, if I don't shave my legs, then I am transgressing the norm. Yeah. So and it might be that I'm doing that because I reject it, but that's still a much more complicated kind of experience than just not shaving your legs, because there are no norms about leg shaving that are relevant to you.
I think that's a really, really interesting example, because it really brings home what it means to sort of see yourself as being subject to a norm. Because, as you rightly say, you're going to feel the force of that norm, even if you absolutely choose to reject it, right? Because, you can't just not shave your legs. You're sort of making a decision not to shave your legs, and you're doing so in rejection of the norm, and that's going to colour the experience of it inevitably.
Yes, I think you're absolutely right. There can be norms which relate to things that only you know about. And actually, I think there are a lot of norms when it comes to motherhood. Many of the norms about motherhood are about how you should feel. So you, for example, should feel only happy when you're near your baby, and you should only really care about your baby. You should find contentment in sacrificing yourself for your baby. And those are internal things, but many of the norms of motherhood are precisely about that. And so somebody like me who does experience the norms of motherhood as relevant, even when I reject them, I will have that same experience of transgression when I'm not feeling the things that the norms of motherhood tell me I should.
Yeah, and I think the kinds of examples that bring that home are where, people say to expectant mothers, you're going to feel in a certain way when you have your child, you'll feel this way, you won't care about X and Y, you'll only care about the child, or whatever it is. And there's a way in which what they think they're doing is just, describing the inevitable reality of the situation. But actually what they're doing is setting up a norm, which then that personally their experience doesn't conform to that. They're going to feel like they're transgressing.
Absolutely. There's some very nice analysis of literature given to parents, to mothers, expectant mothers, that Kukla analyzes in Mass Hysteria, and they pick out just loads of examples of, you will find that you are happiest when you're with your baby. You will find you don't want to be away from your baby very much. Yeah. Just so much, this is how you will feel.
Yeah. And the normativity of that is something that people who say those things probably aren't aware of at all. But you feel it very strongly if it's directed towards you. Okay, right. So that's the account of identity as norm relevance. And so the idea is there that you occupy that identity if you feel yourself as being subject to those social norms, right?
So the second one that Jenkins looks at, once she's gone pluralist, she looks at an account of identity as identification. So this is drawing on the work of Talia Becher, and Becher's account of gender identity holds that when you say, I am a woman, you aren't making a report or describing something. Instead, you are what Betcher calls engaging in existential avowal. So you are saying, you are taking responsibility for for what's really most important to you. So it's an attempt to answer the question of what really matters to me. Who am I really? What do I care about most? And the idea is that when you say, I am a woman, you are making this avowal of what really matters to you, and identifying with the category of woman as reflecting what really matters to you.
And could you describe that as kind of forward-looking in a sense? Because the act of identification is supposed to set up a kind of, I suppose, set up a reality in which people have certain responsibilities towards you, maybe, and you have certain reasons for action and things like that. And it's a kind of normative network that's being set up there.
Betcher talks about it as being about your reasons for action. So I think it's not maybe so much that the act of identification sets up those reasons for action, but that when you're identifying, you're thinking of this role as reflecting, maybe shaping your reasons for action. Yeah. So it doesn't, the act doesn't need to bring the reasons into existence, but it's a reflection of what reasons you take yourself to have.
But the act of saying, I am a mother, on that understanding is not just an attempt to kind of describe something that pre-exists that statement, if I've understood this rightly. So it's perhaps also something like what you described as an avowal, right? So it's taking on the identity and deliberately sort of presenting yourself as having that identity.
Yeah, and thinking of being a mother as shaping the reasons that you have for actions as something that reflects what you value in life and how you will see yourself as required to act.
And then there was one more account of identity that you looked at. So what was that?
That's right. So I'm adding into Jenkins two types of gender identity. A third. This is an account from Florence Ashley. And so Ashley starts by thinking, there is so much variety in how people talk about their gender identity. So someone might say, I knew I was a woman because I always wanted to play with dolls when I was little. I found I wanted to wear these dresses. Somebody might say, when I think about myself as a woman, I think I'm a woman because of the experiences that I've had with a body of this kind. Or somebody might say, I just think about, somebody might talk about the norm relevancy stuff. You know, these are the things that I feel apply to me. So Ashley is trying to find a way to kind of make sense of that variety. So we should think of gender identity as interpretation. So we take all your gendered experiences, all the experiences you have where how people treat you or how you think of yourself is in some way related to gender or affected by gender. And we take all of that, we call that gendered subjectivity. And when you have a gender identity, what you are doing is interpreting that, making sense of that total set of gendered experiences. Yes. And thinking, what way of thinking of myself as a woman, as a man, as a non-binary, what way of thinking of myself makes sense of those set of gendered experiences?
Yeah. Am I right in thinking that, again, as with the view of identity as identification, that there's, again, a sense in which that's an avowal as well, as much as a kind of act of description? So it's not just saying, all things considered, this set of experience is best explained by my being a woman or non-binary or whatever it is. It's kind of saying, I am taking the act of interpreting my experience in those terms, and that's why I have that identity. That's what I'm doing.
So I think this is something I'm adding to Ashley, but I do think that there are important similarities between the identity as interpretation and Becher's identity as an identification. And the way I think about that is, I think there's a difference between sort of thinking this gender identity has this relationship to gendered subjectivity. This is how it makes sense of it. Okay, so I think there's a difference between making claims about or making reports about how much sense a particular gender identity makes of your gendered subjectivity, of your experiences, and actually interpreting it.
Right.
So I think that when you're working out how to interpret something, you think, okay, what different ways, what would make sense of it, how would it make sense of it? Yeah. And then when you actually interpret it that way, that's a further step.
Right, okay.
So, one way to think about this is in ethics, we have theories of emotivism, which distinguish between saying, this is kind or beneficial, and this is good, and say there's a step between saying, this would harm somebody, and it would be wrong. So that's Ayer's theory of emotivism, and it says that it's not a description; it's a further step, a kind of approval or disapproval. So I think there's something similar going on with the difference between thinking about what what makes sense of your experiences and actually performing the interpretation, endorsing the interpretation.
Right, yeah. And is there an analogy with sort of taking on like an ethical, political view as well? So you might think, for example, you might read lots of Marx and think, oh, these arguments are really good. I think this does make the best sense of anything that I've read of, the kind of conditions of society or whatever. But it's a further step to say, therefore, I am a Marxist, right? And so there's an avowal in that kind of way as well, right?
Yeah. I think it's making the judgment, which is a step further than kind of judging that the judgment is supported.
Good. Okay, great. So, right, just to quickly recap then. So we've got three views of identity. We've got identity as norm relevance. We've got identity as identification. And then we've got identity as interpretation. So did you think that any one of those accounts gives the best, account of what's going on?
I'm going to follow Jenkins and be pluralist. So I think those are all important gender identity kinds, important kind of aspects of how we understand our gender. And when it comes to motherhood, I think there are important aspects of our understanding of our gendered parental role or our parental role. But when we're thinking about the question of how do we use the term mother, I think identification should have priority over interpretation, which should have priority over norm relevancy.
Okay, so why do you say that?
Okay, so I think interpretation and identification have two really important features. So one we've already spoken about, that's the non-descriptivism bit. You're not just reporting, you are avowing, you are interpreting. And I think there's something important about if we're thinking about respecting people's self-understanding, and gender identity is supposed to be reflecting how people understand their role, then really respecting their avowals, or what they actually avow, or how they actually interpret, is more important than respecting their reports or what's described. Another feature is what I think of as hierarchy. So I think these two judgments are kind of on a different level than other gender kinds, because norm relevancy is part of the gendered subjectivity, your total gendered experiences, which you are interpreting. So if you have an interpretation of yourself as a woman based on that's your identity as interpretation, and I say, well, no, but you have norm relevancy as a man, and so you must be a man. What I'm doing then is saying, I know more than you about how important norm relevancy is, because the interpretation has already taken norm relevancy into account.
Yes.
And so that's overriding your understanding of your parental role or your gender identity.
And that's bad because it's interfering with someone's autonomy, right? And it's kind of interfering with their right to identify how they want, or something like that.
Right. So yeah, I think there are lots of reasons why respecting somebody's own understanding is important in these areas. I think when it comes to how we should use terms, that's particularly important. I mean, there is lots of literature on the kind of in trans philosophy about the concerns with overriding somebody's understanding of themselves when it comes to gender. So maybe it's good to focus on what Betcher says here. So Betcher argues that if you override somebody's avowal of identity, then that's an interference with autonomy, with their authority to make such avowals about what really matters to them, who they really are, and what their reasons for action are. And Betcher defends what she calls a ethical first-person authority. So she starts by thinking about our attitudes. Lots of philosophers have thought there's some kind of special first-person authority about our mental states and our attitudes. And Betcher says, well, that's a bit weird because we actually are very often wrong. We don't have certainty. We're not infallible about our mental states. Sometimes I think I'm angry because, because of one thing, when actually I'm angry about something completely different. So it doesn't seem like we have a sort of that kind of first-person authority, what she calls an epistemic first-person authority.
So that's an authority about the real facts of the matter.
Yeah, like we can't be wrong. Yeah. So she suggests maybe we have a different kind of authority, an authority to take responsibility for our attitudes. So she thinks about, suppose that you're at a party and somebody says to you, you want to go home now. She thinks there's something odd about that statement. There's something kind of wrong with it because it's not that person's place to make a pronouncement about your desires, especially if that's going to be taken to override your own avowals of, if you say, I want to stay, and they say, no, you want to go home, there's something ethically worrying about that. It's undermining your right to take responsibility for your own attitudes. Okay. And she says there's similar kind of thing going on when it comes to avowals of gender identity. If you say, I'm a woman, and somebody says, no, you're not, then you are undermining their authority to be able to make that kind of avowal of who they really are. And I think that there's a similar kind of concern when it comes to overriding interpretation, because I think we should be able to make sense of ourselves, to interpret ourselves, and not have other people override our interpretations of what makes sense of our very personal experiences. So that's why I think those two are kind of important. I think normally they'll go together. So you would hope that your understanding of what matters most to you and who you really are and what your reasons for action are would fit in with your interpretation of what makes sense of your experiences. I think if that doesn't happen, there is a tension, there's a problem. It's kind of instability. Ashley does argue that it can happen. So, Ashley says that you can't, that our understanding of ideals, political considerations feed into our interpretation, but we don't have kind of complete control over our interpretations. So you can't kind of theorize yourself into having a particular interpretation. So that I think opens up space for them to come apart. Yes. And I think it's right that is a possibility that they could come apart. And if they do come apart, I think we should think, well, what would be the most respectful way to use a gender term? And I think it would probably be to refer to identity as identification, given that if you are in that situation, surely it's the forward-looking identification that you want to stay, and your hope is that the interpretation will come to match that. So respecting their own self-understanding would involve respecting identification.
Great, thank you. So, we're nearly out of time, but I just wanted to ask one more question. I wonder what you think about this, and I suppose I'm maybe playing devil's advocate a little bit here, but I wonder what you think about this. So, this might come out a bit more in kind of what you're doing, I take it, which is defending an account of identification where it can come apart from norm relevance in particular. So I suppose someone might say, remember what we're doing here is we're trying to work out who counts as a mother, because we're seeing this in the context of the wider project of critiquing normative motherhood, right? And someone might say, well, not everyone who identifies as a mother in the kind of way that you're talking about in those examples that you gave at the beginning is actually going to be subject to that ideal norm of motherhood in the same way that, there's lots of cases and it's a bit complicated, but, imagine, for example, a gay man who identifies as the mother of his child, despite identifying as a man. Well, someone might say, well, is that person really going to be kind of subject to that kind of oppressive norm of motherhood in the same way that, a woman occupying that the role of mother is going to be subject to? Does that make sense? And what would you say to that?
Absolutely. So the first thing is that I've been focusing on gender identity. Jenkins picks out other gender kinds, and I think that each of those gives rise to a gendered parental role which is relevant to our project of resistance to normative motherhood. Right. And so what I've been kind of looking at is how should we use the term mother? But I think we should use the term mother to reflect people's self-understandings. And we should also remember the other gender kinds and come up with new terms for those and for that way of being affected by normative motherhood. I just want to say one thing, because In saying all that, I've been talking about respecting the parent's self-understanding. Actually, I want to be clear that I don't think that parental self-understanding is all that matters here. I think what we should really be aiming for is to reflect a joint, shared understanding between the parent and the child. Because unlike gender identity, gendered parental roles are relational. You can't be a parent unless there is some child. I mean, there are sad cases where your child is no longer around, and your child might be an adult, but so including all of that, there has to be, in some sense, a child who you're a mother of. Yes. And if they're old enough to have views, their own understanding of the relationship, those matter too. So we're not just going to be focusing on what the parent thinks. We're going to be looking at how the parent and child understand their relationship.
Yes, and of course, I take it there are going to be problematic cases where those two points of view conflict, but we won't have time to discuss those today because we've run out of time. So, well, maybe I can invite you to come back and do another podcast and we can talk about some of those issues. But for the meantime, thank you so much, Fiona Woollard, for coming on the podcast.
Thank you very much for having me.
If you enjoyed this episode of Ethics Untangled, please like and subscribe and recommend us to your friends. The podcast is edited by Mark Smith at Leeds Media Services, and our music is by Kate Wood. Ethics Untangled is brought to you by the Idea Centre, a specialist unit for teaching, research, training and consultancy in applied ethics at the University of Leeds. We offer master's programmes in healthcare ethics and applied and professional ethics, and PhDs available full or part-time and face-to-face or by online learning. We also offer consultancy and training services for business and the professions, including help with the difficult ethical issues faced by your organisation, commissioned research projects, and online or face-to-face CPD. If you'd like to find out more about these or any of our other activities, please visit our website at ahc.leeds.ac.uk/ethics.